home from World War I to find that their jobs were gone. Unemployment doubled to nearly 12%. Stock market was on its way to losing half of its value. The gross national product was in free fall. Outgoing President Woodrow Wilson's decision to involve America in World War I and his dyed-in-the-wool progressive agenda left the country reeling. Wilson had used the war effort to grossly expand an already bloated federal government. And in an effort to redistribute the wealth, he raised the top income tax to 77%. The end result was a country deeply in debt with an economy that was on the verge of total collapse. This was the Depression you probably never heard of, wiped clean from our history books. Why? It's called the Forgotten Depression. More on that in a minute. Another key factor in this economic nightmare was the action taken by the Federal Reserve, another Wilson-era progressive idea. As times got tougher during Wilson's last term, the Fed began to print money and make it easier to get credit. Even as America's 29th president, Warren G. Harding, took an oath of office in 1921, the country was on the brink. He wasted no time. His plan was astonishingly simple. No bailouts, no stimulus package. In fact, just the opposite.
Between 1920 and 22, the federal budget was in fact cut roughly in half. They cut top marginal income tax rates and marginal income tax rates for all groups substantially throughout the 20s. After they cut marginal tax rates so substantially, they were also able to cut the national debt, not the deficit, the national debt, by 1/3 during the 1920s.
The budget was cut in half. Tax rates reduced in all income brackets. The national debt reduced by 1/3. In 18 months, America rebounded. The result? The Roaring '20s.
It was during the 1920s that millions of Americans bought their first radio, millions of Americans bought their first refrigerator, their first car. The number of Americans who had telephone doubled.
President Harding died of a heart attack 2 years into his presidency, but his successor, Calvin Coolidge, continued what he had started.
I want the people of America to be able to work less for the government and more for themselves. I want them to have the rewards of their own industry. This is the chief meaning of freedom.
Limited government and free enterprise fueled one of the greatest success stories in American history. Again, you probably never heard of this.
We never hear a thing about the Depression of 1920 for obvious reasons, because we might draw the wrong conclusions. We might conclude that maybe these policies could be implemented today. We're not allowed to draw that conclusion, so this episode is simply left off the table.
What the history books can't deny is just 9 years later, in spite of all the country had been through, progressive presidents, Herbert Hoover, FDR, following Woodrow Wilson's progressive playbook of bloated government, massive spending, and sky-high taxes, led us back to the brink, the Great Depression. And by the way, in another undeniable example of progressive revisionist history, you, me, our kids have all been taught that FDR's New Deal proved to be the salvation of America. Nothing could be further from the truth. The New Deal expanded government to levels approaching a dictatorship. Taxes reached obscene levels, and the era of government entitlements, many of which are still choking our economy today, was born. The New Deal prolonged the Great Depression in America. As other countries around the world rebounded years earlier, America suffered through a full decade of hardship. And yet, surprisingly, unexplainably, it's that very solution that serves as the model for our leaders today as America once again suffers through a crisis brought on by progressive leadership. The Forgotten Depression, forgotten no more. To know where you are, you've got to know your history, where we've been.
Up next, the separation of church and state. Did you know that phrase doesn't appear in any of our founding documents? Our founders did want to keep the state out of the church, but not the church out of the state. The truth is on the way. Next. Welcome back to a special hour on Revisionist History on the Glenn Beck program. We've got Hillsdale College professor Burton Folsom Jr. here to help us out with this crash course on revisionist history. One of the most commonly misunderstood phrases in the history of this country is, quote, separation of church and state. Our founders intended one thing, and the governments of today believe another.
How many believe that that our founders put in a separation of church and state to protect the people from church? How many people here believe that it was separation of church and state means that that was put in there as a protection from of the church from state? Okay, and some are not sure. Is there another answer than that? Or you're just unsure? You'd say the other way around? You'd say protect the state from the church. David?
Separation church and state, let me go at it another way. Number one, the phrase doesn't exist in any constitutional document, any government document. So we're now talking about a metaphor that has no place in the Constitution except because judges tell us it belongs there.
Right.
Second is the history of the phrase. If you want to attach it to the First Amendment, go to the Bill of Rights. The purpose of the Bill of Rights goes back to the Declaration. There's a creator. He gives inalienable rights. Government exists to protect those rights. The Bill of Rights exists for no other purpose than to make sure we have the right to practice what the Creator told us we could do.
This is really important. This is going to blow your mind. This is a training manual from the Air Force, 1954. Now listen to this. This is unbelievable. The idea uppermost in the minds of men who founded the United States was that each and every human being was important. They were convinced that the importance of the individual did not come from any grant from the state. This importance of the individual did not come from any position he had achieved, nor from power he had acquired, nor from any wealth he had amassed. They knew the importance of man came from the very source of his life. Because man was made in the image and likeness of God, he had a destiny to achieve. So in other words, there's something you've been sent here to do. You're not just a schlub that has been pumped out in a baby factory. You made a deal with the Creator, and He sent you down to achieve something. You have purpose. And because of that, He had a destiny to achieve, He had inalienable rights, and the inherent in freedom, a freedom to achieve it. That is the basic idea.
Yeah. Now,
that's incredible.
If you take that and go back to separation of church and state, the purpose of the Bill of Rights is to protect an inherent and alienable right, which is the right of conscience, the right to worship God, however we want to describe it. When they wrote the First Amendment, they used both terms. The interesting thing is everything in the Bill of Rights does not limit a citizen at all. Everything limits the government. The First Amendment says Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. No individual is prohibited from anything. Congress is told it can't set up a religion and it can't stop anybody from practicing their religion.
That's what's protecting. You can't have a state. When you say protecting the state from a religion, it is that. We can't become a theocracy. We don't want the state telling us how to live our lives and practice worship of God.
We know that the founders were all religious people, and we know that they talked about God in government documents as well as in their private writings. What happened? Why is it that God is banished by the government from the marketplace, from the public square today?
Well, there was no mention of a wall of separation in any of the founding documents.
Right.
It comes in the next century with Thomas Jefferson. And when it comes, Jefferson is talking about protecting the Baptists of Danbury, Connecticut from interference by the state, not protecting anything by the state from religious groups. So the distortion is absolutely enormous.
Is it fair to say that the drafters of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, especially the First Amendment, which guarantees freedom of speech and guarantees freedom of religion, and that the government will not establish or fund a particular religion or force a religion on you, these people understood that God was a part of their lives and would be a part of their lives. They just didn't want the government having anything to do with the church.
They didn't want the government to set up a theocracy or an established religion. Other than that, they wanted had Christian influence on all parts of the United States.
Thanks, Professor. Glenn says it's not the big banks that are bringing us down, it's the unions. The history of labor unions in America is next on the Glenn Beck program. Now back with part 3 of the Glenn Beck program's 5-day back-to-school crash course. Tonight, U.S. history as you've never learned about it before. Glenn feels that unions are misunderstood. They may say they want to help out the little people, but when you trace back to their roots, they weren't exactly for equal rights for all.
The real ticking time bomb in this country? Unions. It's not the national debt. No. It's the debt to the unions and the union workers. Pensions. You see, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And that is exactly the way people in power like it. You've got to change your perspective, and the way to do it is to learn history. If I asked you, why do we have labor unions? You would say, and partly correctly, because of out-of-control companies. But if I asked you about the turn of the century, and I said, tell me what you know about the Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers and the Carnegies, you would probably say, answer yourself now, they're rich, they were robber barons, they were industrialists, they were bad guys. Okay? Now if I said, at the same time, tell me about the unions of that time period, you would probably say, well, they were for the little people. They were, trying to help people, get work and have it be fair, minority groups, Irish, black, Chinese, everything else. You'd be guessing, but that's probably what you would believe. Crystal clear on the robber barons, I'm guessing. My question is to you, why is it that the Marxist, the communist, and the progressive unions have a history that is kind of fuzzy and happy, and yet the capitalist robber barons are crystal clear in your mind? All you remember about unions is stuff like this growing up. Look for the union label. When I put the glasses of history on your face, you will not